Beloved Barry Gibb sits alone in a quiet room filled with fading light and the soft hum of old vinyl, his voice trembling as he finally admits that no matter how many decades pass, there is still one empty chair in his heart that no song has ever been able to fill. He says people think time heals everything, but there are some losses that only grow louder in the silence, and the brother he misses every day still whispers to him in the pauses between his breaths. Barry begins by describing how the world remembers the Bee Gees as a shining trio of harmony and brotherhood, but behind the glittering stages and screaming fans, there was always a fragile thread holding their family together. He talks about growing up with Robin, Maurice, and Andy in a whirlwind of music and expectation where love and rivalry danced side by side like uneasy partners. Andy was the youngest, the one with the smile that could light up a room, and from the moment he was a boy, he wanted nothing more than to follow his older brothers into the bright, unforgiving spotlight. Barry remembers watching him stare at their gold records with wide eyes, dreaming of being just like them, never knowing how heavy that dream would one day become. As Barry's voice softens, he reveals how Andy's rise was meteoric and terrifying all at once. One minute he was a shy kid tagging along to rehearsals, and the next he was a global heartthrob with hit after hit, surrounded by adoring fans and Hollywood royalty. Barry remembers Andy meeting people like Diana Ross and Olivia Newton-John, laughing and joking as if he belonged in that world. Yet later at night he would call Barry in tears, saying he felt like an imposter trapped in someone else's life. Those phone calls, Barry admits, still haunt him because he often didn't know what to say, and sometimes he was too busy trying to hold his own world together to really hear how desperate Andy had become. He speaks about the hidden side of fame, the late nights, and the endless pressure to be perfect, and how Andy's sensitive heart was slowly being crushed by it all. Barry says there were moments when he could see the darkness creeping in, little changes in Andy's voice, a sadness behind the jokes, but they all kept telling themselves it was just stress, just exhaustion, just another phase that would pass. Deep down, Barry confesses, he feared something was terribly wrong, yet he didn't push hard enough, and that regret has become one of the heaviest burdens he carries. Barry's memories drift back to a time when the Bee Gees were at the height of their power, touring the world and recording songs that would define a generation. He recalls walking into a studio in Los Angeles and seeing Andy sitting quietly in the corner, watching them record with a look that was part pride and part longing. Andy wanted so badly to be part of that magic, but he also wanted to prove he could stand on his own, and that inner conflict tore at him in ways no one could fully understand. Barry says he sometimes wonders if Andy felt abandoned by them, even though they loved him deeply, and that thought breaks his heart all over again. The room seems to grow smaller as Barry talks about the first time he realized Andy's struggles were more than just emotional. There were whispers about his health, moments when Andy looked pale and tired, and doctor's visits that were brushed off with nervous jokes. Barry admits that illness and fear often hide behind bravado, and Andy was a master at pretending everything was fine. He smiles sadly as he says Andy would always say he was okay, that he just needed a little rest, but in his eyes there was a quiet plea that Barry now recognizes too late. As the story deepens, Barry reveals how the family tried to come together, how Robin and Maurice worried just as much, each in their own way, but the chaos of their careers kept pulling them apart. There were arguments, misunderstandings, and long stretches without real conversations, and Andy slipped further into isolation during those gaps. Barry remembers one heartbreaking night when Andy called him and said he felt invisible, even though millions of people knew his name. That contradiction, Barry says, is one of the cruelest things about fame, and it was slowly destroying his little brother. Barry's voice cracks when he talks about the last time he saw Andy before everything changed. They were in a hotel room, surrounded by the muffled sounds of a city that never sleeps, and Andy looked at him with a tired smile that Barry now realizes was a goodbye in disguise. Andy told him he loved him, and Barry laughed it off, thinking there would be plenty of tomorrows to say those words again. Now, decades later, Barry wishes he had held him tighter, spoken more honestly, and told him how much he truly mattered. He leans back, eyes glistening, and admits that even now he sometimes wakes up expecting to hear Andy's voice on the phone, full of hope and fear all at once. The world sees the Bee Gees as legends, but Barry sees three brothers who lost a fourth piece of their soul, and that wound has never closed. Every song he writes, every harmony he sings, carries a trace of Andy's laughter and his pain, echoing through the years like a ghost that refuses to be forgotten. Barry pauses, letting the silence speak for him, and in that stillness you can feel the weight of everything he has never said out loud. The story of Andy Gibb is not just one of stardom and tragedy. It is a story of a family that loved fiercely and failed imperfectly, and Barry is only now finding the core, age to face the truth of it all. His eyes drift toward an old photograph on the wall, and for a moment it seems like he is speaking directly to the brother he lost, as if hoping that somewhere, somehow, Andy can still hear him. The quiet stretches on as Barry's gaze lingers on that faded photograph, and when he finally speaks again, it is as though he is stepping back into a world that no longer exists, a world where Andy was still alive and laughing, still dreaming about tomorrow. Barry says there are memories he has never shared publicly, not even with his own family, because they are too painful and too tangled with guilt. He remembers the weeks before Andy's health began to visibly fail, when there were rumors swirling through Hollywood about his wild lifestyle and the pressure he was under, and how those rumors followed him like shadows wherever he went. People like Elton John and even film producers who were circling Andy for possible roles would whisper their concerns, but no one wanted to be the one to admit how serious things had become. Barry recalls receiving a call late one night from a mutual friend who said Andy had been rushed to the hospital, his body betraying him after years of pushing too hard. When Barry arrived, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the harsh fluorescent lights felt like a cruel contrast to the bright stages Andy was used to. Andy lay there looking small and fragile, nothing like the confident star the world adored, and Barry felt a wave of terror he had never known before. He took Andy's hand and felt how cold it was, and in that moment he realized how close they were to losing him. Andy tried to joke, even then, telling Barry not to worry, but his voice was weak and strained, and there was a look in his eyes that felt like a confession. Barry says Andy whispered that he was tired, not just physically but in a way that went all the way down to his soul. He spoke about feeling like he had disappointed everyone, about how he could never live up to the Bee Gees' legacy, and how the world expected him to be something he didn't know how to be anymore. Barry listened, stunned by the depth of his brother's despair, and promised him they would get through it together. Yet behind those promises, there was a growing fear that something was slipping beyond their control. Doctors spoke in careful, guarded tones about Andy's heart and the damage that had been done, but they also tried to reassure Barry that rest and treatment could help. Barry clung to those words, desperate for hope, while inside he felt a quiet dread that he couldn't shake. He admits now that part of him was afraid to push too hard for answers, afraid of what they might reveal, and that hesitation still torments him. As Andy's condition fluctuated, there were days when he seemed almost like his old self, laughing and talking about new songs he wanted to write. Barry remembers Andy mentioning how he dreamed of working again with big names, maybe even stepping into film like some of the Hollywood stars he admired. He spoke about people like Barbra Streisand and how their voices could fill a room with emotion. And Andy wanted to do the same, to leave something beautiful behind. Hearing those dreams made Barry's heart ache, because he could see how much Andy still wanted to live, even as his body was failing him. But there were darker moments, too, moments Andy would never let the cameras or the fans see. Barry talks about sitting with him in quiet hospital rooms, listening as Andy confessed how lonely he felt, how fame had surrounded him with people, but left him without anyone who truly understood him. He said he felt like he was drowning in expectations, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't reach the surface. Barry says those words cut him deeply because he realized too late that Andy had been asking for help in the only way he knew how. The tension within the Gibb family grew as they tried to navigate this crisis. Robin and Maurice were worried and frustrated, each dealing with their fear in different ways, and sometimes their disagreements made everything feel even more fragile. Barry admits there were heated conversations, moments when blame and regret filled the air, and all of it only added to the heartbreak. Andy, caught in the middle, often tried to smooth things over, even though he was the one suffering the most. Barry's voice trembles as he describes one especially painful night when Andy broke down, tears streaming down his face as he apologized for being a burden. He told Barry he felt like he had ruined everything, that he was afraid his legacy would be one of failure and disappointment. Barry held him and told him he was loved, that none of that was true, but he now wonders if those words were enough to reach him. That memory, he says, is one he will carry to his grave. As the days passed, Andy's health continued to decline, and the reality they were all trying to avoid became harder to ignore. Barry remembers looking at the heart monitors and feeling a growing panic, as if time itself was running out. He wanted to believe in miracles, but there was an unspoken understanding in the room that something terrible was coming. Andy seemed to sense it too, and there was a quiet intensity in his eyes that made Barry's chest tighten with fear. Barry leans forward, his hands clasped tightly, and admits that the last conversations he had with Andy before everything changed are etched into his mind with painful clarity. There were words spoken that he has never repeated, promises made that he never got the chance to keep, and a feeling of unfinished business that still haunts him. He says sometimes he hears Andy's voice in his dreams, calling out to him, asking questions that can never be answered. The room feels heavy with all the things left unsaid, and Barry's story moves slowly toward a moment he has been dreading to revisit. He takes a long breath, as if gathering the strength to step back into that unbearable time, and his eyes glisten with tears that refuse to fall. Somewhere in the silence, you can feel the presence of a young man who wanted so badly to be loved and understood, and a brother who is only now finding the courage to speak his truth. Barry says the day everything changed arrived without warning, like a storm breaking over a calm sea, and even now his body remembers the shock of it. He was in the middle of a quiet morning when the phone rang, and before he even answered, he felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. The voice on the other end was strained and hurried, telling him that Andy had taken a sudden turn, that his heart was failing, and that there was very little time. Barry remembers dropping the receiver, his hands shaking as if they no longer belonged to him, and in that moment he knew that the world he had shared with his youngest brother was slipping away. He rushed to the hospital, every second stretching into an eternity, replaying every conversation, every missed opportunity, every moment he wished he could go back and change. When he arrived, the atmosphere was heavy with urgency and quiet despair. Doctors and nurses moving quickly, but with a look that told him more than their words ever could. Andy lay there, pale and still, machines humming softly around him, and Barry felt an overwhelming wave of helplessness wash over him. He took Andy's hand again, desperate to feel any sign of life, any spark of the brother he loved. Barry's voice drops to a whisper as he describes the last moments they shared. Andy's eyes fluttered open, and for a brief second there was recognition, a flicker of the old warmth that had always been there. He tried to speak, his lips trembling, and Barry leaned in close, straining to hear every word. Andy told him he was scared, that he didn't want to go, and that he wished he had more time to make things right. Barry told him he was not alone, that he was loved beyond words, but even as he said it, he could feel how fragile that moment was. Then Andy said something that Barry has never been able to forget, something that still echoes in his mind like a final, heartbreaking confession. He said he was sorry for everything, sorry for the pain he had caused, sorry for not being strong enough to carry the weight of his dreams. Barry broke down, telling him there was nothing to forgive, that his life meant more than any chart-topping hit or headline ever could. But Andy's eyes were already drifting, and there was a quiet acceptance in his face that felt like a goodbye. When Andy's heart finally gave out, the room fell into a devastating silence that Barry says felt louder than any crowd he had ever faced. He remembers screaming his brother's name, begging him to come back, as if sheer willpower could undo what had just happened. The doctors gently pulled him away, but the damage was already done, and in that moment Barry felt a part of himself die as well. He says that no matter how many years pass, that sound of flatlining machines is still burned into his memory. The aftermath was a blur of grief and disbelief, a world that kept moving even though Barry felt completely frozen. News of Andy's death spread quickly, and suddenly there were cameras, reporters, and fans all mourning a star they barely knew, while Barry was struggling to process the loss of a brother who had been part of his soul. He remembers seeing tributes from celebrities and Hollywood figures, all praising Andy's talent and charm, but none of it could touch the raw, private pain he and his family were feeling. To the world, Andy was a tragic icon, but to Barry he was just a little brother who should have had so many more years. Barry talks about the funeral, about standing beside Robin and Maurice as they said goodbye, each of them breaking in their own way. He recalls the sound of sobbing, the smell of flowers, and the unbearable finality of it all. There were moments when he felt numb, as if he were watching someone else's life unfold, and others when the pain was so sharp he could hardly breathe. He admits there were times he wondered if he could ever sing again, because every note reminded him of what he had lost. In the weeks that followed, Barry says he was consumed by questions and regrets. He replayed every conversation, every sign he had missed, and every chance he had to help Andy that he didn't take. He wondered if things might have been different if he had been more present, more insistent, more willing to confront the reality of Andy's illness. That guilt became a quiet companion, following him through every studio session and every performance, whispering "what if" over and over again. The Bee Gees tried to keep going, but there was an emptiness in their music that even they couldn't ignore. Barry says that sometimes when he sang, he could almost hear Andy's voice weaving through the harmonies, a ghostly reminder of what once was. Fans would tell them how much Andy had meant to them, how his songs had gotten them through hard times, and Barry would smile and thank them, even as his heart was breaking all over again. That contrast between public adoration and private sorrow was almost too much to bear. Barry admits that there were days he didn't want to get out of bed, days when the weight of loss felt unbearable. He would sit alone, listening to Andy's records, and feel as though his brother was still there with him, just out of reach. Those moments were both comforting and cruel because they reminded him of how much he loved Andy and how much he had lost. And in that lonely space, Barry began to realize that the story of Andy Gibb was far from over, that there were truths still buried beneath the surface that he had yet to face. As he looks back now, his eyes filled with tears and reflection, Barry says the pain of losing Andy has never faded. It has only changed shape. It lives in every melody, every quiet moment, every memory that refuses to let go. And as he prepares to reveal even more about what happened behind the scenes, you can feel that the deepest wounds are still waiting to be opened. Barry says that after Andy was gone, a strange silence settled over his life, one that no amount of music or applause could ever fill. The world kept demanding new songs, new tours, new moments of joy, but inside he felt hollow, as if something essential had been torn away. He admits that for a long time he couldn't bring himself to talk about Andy, not even with Robin and Maurice, because every word felt like it would reopen a wound that had barely begun to close. Instead, he buried himself in work, hoping that staying busy would somehow numb the ache. But grief has a way of finding you no matter how far you try to run. In private moments, Barry would sit with old tapes and recordings, listening to Andy's voice and remembering the way he used to laugh when he hit a perfect note. Those sounds were like echoes from another lifetime, and they made him feel both comforted and devastated at the same time. He says there were nights when he would play Andy's songs over and over, as if trying to keep him alive through sheer repetition. In those moments, the world outside faded away, and it was just two brothers again, sharing music and dreams. Barry also talks about the guilt that grew heavier with every passing year. He wondered if Andy's struggles had been overlooked because the family was so consumed by their own success and problems. There were moments when he questioned whether the Bee Gees' fame had created a shadow that Andy could never step out of, no matter how bright his own star shone. Barry admits that sometimes he feels responsible for that shadow, for not doing more to protect his little brother from the crushing weight of expectation. As time went on, the stories about Andy in the media began to change, turning his life into a cautionary tale about excess and tragedy. Barry found that unbearable because it reduced a complex, sensitive young man into a headline. He wanted the world to know about Andy's kindness, his humor, the way he would call just to say he missed them, even when he was in the middle of a whirlwind of fame. But those quieter truths didn't fit into the dramatic narratives people wanted, and Barry felt as if Andy was being lost all over again. He remembers talking to other artists who had known Andy, people who understood the price of fame in their own ways. Some of them shared stories of their own struggles, of feeling isolated despite being surrounded by fans and colleagues. And Barry realized that Andy's pain was part of a much larger, darker pattern in Hollywood. The industry had a way of taking everything from you, even your sense of self, and Andy had been too young and too vulnerable to withstand it. That realization only deepened Barry's sorrow, because it meant his brother had been fighting a battle that few people could see. Barry also opens up about how Andy's death changed the dynamic within the Gibb family. Robin and Maurice were grieving just as deeply, but they each coped in their own ways, and sometimes that created distance between them. There were moments when they couldn't even mention Andy's name without breaking down, and others when they argued about what they could have done differently. Barry says those tensions were painful, but they were also a sign of how much they all loved him, how much his absence had torn a hole through their lives. In rare moments of quiet honesty, Barry would imagine what Andy's life might have been like if he had survived. He pictured him growing older, maybe starting a family, maybe rediscovering his love for music in a way that wasn't so tied to fame and pressure. Those imagined futures were bittersweet, because they were beautiful and impossible at the same time. Barry says that sometimes he feels like he is carrying those lost possibilities with him, a weight that will never truly lift. There is also a part of the story that Barry has struggled to face, a sense that there were deeper truths about Andy's illness and the toll it took on his body that were never fully addressed. He hints at conversations with doctors and family members that left him uneasy, as if not everything had been said out loud. Whether it was fear, denial, or the chaos of the moment, there are details that still feel shrouded in mystery, and Barry admits that uncertainty has haunted him for decades. Not knowing if there was something more that could have been done is a question that never ceased. Missed a fade. Barry's voice grows quieter as he talks about how he eventually returned to the stage, how he kept singing even when every lyric felt like it was tearing at his heart. Fans would cheer, unaware that behind his smile was a man still mourning a brother he had lost too soon. Sometimes, in the middle of a performance, he would catch himself looking out into the crowd, half expecting to see Andy's familiar face smiling back at him. That fleeting illusion would vanish in an instant, leaving him with a fresh wave of grief. Yet even in that pain, Barry says there was a strange sense of connection, a feeling that Andy was still somehow present in the music they had all shared. Every harmony, every melody felt like a thread tying them together across time and loss. It was as if Andy's spirit lived on in the songs, refusing to be silenced by death. And in those moments, Barry would allow himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, his brother was still listening. The years rolled on, but the ache never truly disappeared. Barry says that as he grew older, the memories of Andy became even more vivid, as if the past was calling out to him, asking to be remembered. He realized that carrying this story alone was no longer enough, that there were truths he needed to speak before it was too late. And as he prepares to share even more of what he has kept hidden for so long, the weight of those memories hangs heavy in the air, waiting to be released. Barry says that as the years turned into decades, he found himself thinking about Andy more often, not less, as if time was slowly pulling the memories closer instead of pushing them away. There were mornings when he would wake up, and for a brief, fragile moment, he would forget that Andy was gone, only to feel the truth crash back into him like a wave. He describes that feeling as one of the cruelest tricks the mind can play, offering a glimpse of happiness only to snatch it away. In those moments, he would lie still, staring at the ceiling and whisper Andy's name, just to hear it out loud. He talks about how grief changes as you age, how it becomes quieter, but no less heavy. When he was younger, the pain was sharp and overwhelming, but now it is a constant, aching presence that never really leaves him. He says there are days when a simple song on the radio or a familiar melody can bring him to tears without warning. Those songs remind him not only of Andy's talent, but of all the conversations they never got to have, all the moments they never got to share. Barry also reflects on the way the world has continued to celebrate Andy's music, even as the truth of his life has become more complicated in the public eye. Fans still adore him, still see him as a beautiful, tragic figure, but few understand the depth of his struggles. Barry wishes people could have seen Andy as he really was, vulnerable and kind, trying desperately to find his place in a world that demanded too much of him. That disconnect between the public image and the private reality is something Barry says still feels painfully unfair. In recent years, Barry has found himself opening up more to people who ask about Andy, even though it hurts. There is a sense of responsibility, he feels, a need to protect his brother's memory from being oversimplified or misunderstood. He talks about conversations with younger artists who look up to the Bee Gees and to Andy, and how he tries to warn them about the dangers of losing themselves in fame. Andy's story, he believes, can still serve a purpose, even if it came at such a devastating cost. There is also a part of Barry that still struggles with unanswered questions. He wonders about the exact chain of events that led to Andy's final days, about whether there were warning signs that were ignored or downplayed. He admits that there were moments when he felt anger, not just at the situation, but at himself, and even at the people who were supposed to be taking care of Andy. That anger has softened over time, but it has never completely disappeared, lingering beneath the surface of his grief. Barry's voice grows heavier as he recalls how the loss of Andy was followed by the loss of Maurice years later. Another blow that made the absence of his youngest brother feel even more profound. Losing two brothers changed the way he saw the world, the way he saw himself, and the way he approached music. There were times when he felt as if the Bee Gees, as he had always known them, no longer existed, and that realization brought its own kind of sorrow. Andy's death had been the first fracture, and everything that came after seemed to deepen it. In quieter moments, Barry imagines conversations he wishes he could have with Andy now. He would tell him how much he is still loved, how his music continues to touch people around the world, and how he has never been forgotten. He would ask him about the things that haunted him, about what he was truly feeling in those final years, and whether he ever found any peace. Those imagined dialogues are both comforting and heartbreaking, because they are filled with the answers he will never receive. Barry also speaks about how he has tried to find meaning in the loss, even when it feels impossible. He believes that carrying Andy's memory forward is a way of honoring him, of making sure his life mattered beyond the tragedy of his death. Every time he steps on stage, Every time he sings, he feels as though he is carrying Andy with him, a silent partner in every performance. That connection, he says, is one of the few things that helps him keep going. As he sits there now, older and more reflective than ever, Barry admits that he is finally ready to say some of the things he has been holding inside for so long. There are truths about Andy's life and death that he has never fully shared, not because he wanted to hide them, but because he was afraid of what they might reveal about his own regrets and failures. Speaking them out loud feels like opening a door he has kept locked for decades. And as that door begins to creak open, the weight of everything he has carried becomes almost too much to bear. Barry takes a long breath, as if steadying himself for the most painful part of the story, and says that there are moments he still replays over and over, moments that feel unfinished, as though something vital was left behind in the chaos of those final days. He speaks about a conversation he had with Andy not long before he was rushed back to the hospital, a quiet exchange that never made it into any official account. Andy had sounded different, more fragile, and he told Barry that he felt like his body was giving up on him, even though his heart still wanted to keep going. Barry tried to reassure him, but deep down he sensed a desperation in Andy's voice that chilled him. That call ended abruptly, with Andy saying he loved him and that he hoped they would talk again soon. Barry never imagined that those would be among the last words he would ever hear from his little brother. When he thinks about it now, he wonders if Andy was trying to say goodbye in the only way he could, without causing more pain. That thought brings both a strange sense of peace and an unbearable ache, because it means Andy may have known more about what was coming than anyone realized. Barry also reveals that after Andy's death, there were details about his medical condition that left him unsettled. He was told about the strain Andy's heart had been under, about the damage that years of pushing too hard had caused, but there were also things that felt vague and incomplete. He remembers asking questions that never seemed to get clear answers, and that uncertainty has stayed with him, like a shadow that never quite goes away. Whether it was the limits of medicine or the chaos of the moment, Barry still feels there were pieces of the truth that slipped through the cracks. He talks about how that lack of closure affected his grief, making it harder to move forward. When you don't fully understand how someone you love slipped away, your mind keeps searching for reasons, for something to hold on to. Barry admits that he sometimes imagines different scenarios, different choices that might have changed the outcome, even though he knows it's a painful and endless loop. Those imagined possibilities are like ghosts, haunting him with what could have been. As the story unfolds, Barry's voice softens with a kind of weary honesty. He says that for a long time he blamed himself, thinking that if he had been more attentive, more forceful, or more present, Andy might still be here. That self-blame became a quiet companion, following him through every success and every applause, reminding him of the brother he couldn't save. Even now, after all these years, that feeling hasn't completely faded. Barry also reflects on how Andy's death changed the way he views fame and success. The things that once seemed so important, the awards, the charts, the adoration, all feel small compared to the loss of someone you love. He says that Andy's life is a constant reminder that no amount of success can protect you from pain or illness, and that the cost of chasing dreams can at times be devastating. That realization has made him more cautious, more reflective, and more determined to value the people in his life over the applause of strangers. In a deeply emotional moment, Barry admits that he still talks to Andy, even though he knows he can't hear him in the way he once did. He will sometimes sit alone and speak out loud, telling his brother about his day, about the music he is still making, and about how much he misses him. Those quiet conversations are a way of keeping Andy close, of refusing to let him disappear completely. They are also a way of soothing the part of Barry that still feels like a grieving older brother, waiting for his little sibling to come home. Barry's eyes fill with tears as he describes how, in his dreams, Andy is often young and healthy again, smiling the way he used to when everything still felt possible. In those dreams, they talk and laugh, and for a brief moment it feels like nothing bad ever happened. Waking up from those dreams is both beautiful and devastating because it brings the truth crashing back in. But Barry says he wouldn't trade those dreams for anything because they are one of the few places where he can still be with Andy. As he reaches the end of this part of his story, Barry's voice carries a sense of both sorrow and quiet strength. He knows he can't change what happened, but he also knows that telling Andy's story honestly is a way of honoring him. There is still more he wants to share, more memories and truths that have been waiting for years to be spoken. And as he prepares to open up even further, you can feel that this journey through grief and love is not yet finished. Barry sits quietly for a long moment, as if listening to something only he can hear, and then he begins to speak with a softness that feels almost like a confession. He says that as he has grown older, the weight of everything he lost with Andy has become clearer, sharper, and more personal. When you are young, you think you have all the time in the world to fix mistakes and say the things that matter. But time has a way of slipping through your fingers when you are not paying attention. Andy's death taught him that lesson in the most brutal way possible. He remembers the early days before fame when they were just boys singing together and dreaming about a future that seemed endless. Andy used to follow him everywhere, asking questions, copying his melodies, trying to find his own voice in the shadow of his older brothers. Barry smiles sadly as he recalls how proud Andy was whenever he managed to impress them, how his whole face would light up when Barry praised his singing. Those memories are precious now, little fragments of a happier time that he holds on to when the grief feels overwhelming. Barry also talks about how Andy's absence has shaped his relationships with everyone else in his life. There is a part of him that is always afraid of losing the people he loves, a part that is constantly on guard against another devastating goodbye. That fear, he admits, can make it hard to fully relax or trust in the permanence of anything. Andy's death left a scar that never healed, and it colors everything Barry does, even now. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Barry admits that there were times when he felt angry at Andy for leaving, even though he knows it wasn't something Andy chose. That anger was mixed with love and sorrow, creating a storm of emotions that he struggled to make sense of. It took him years to realize that those feelings were part of grief, not a betrayal of his brother's memory. Accepting that complexity has been one of the hardest parts of his journey. Barry also speaks about the way Andy is still present in the family, even though he is gone. There are moments when someone will say something or laugh in a certain way, and it feels exactly like Andy, as if his spirit is still woven into their lives. Those small reminders can be both comforting and painful because they make his absence feel even more real. Yet Barry says he wouldn't trade them for anything because they keep Andy close. As he reflects on everything that has happened, Barry acknowledges that he will never fully understand all the forces that led to Andy's tragic end. Illness, pressure, fear, and the relentless demands of fame all played a role, and there is no simple explanation that can make it hurt less. What he does know is that Andy was loved deeply, and that his life mattered, far beyond the way it ended. That truth is something Barry holds on to when the questions become too heavy. Barry's voice grows steadier as he talks about the importance of remembering Andy not just as a tragic figure, but as a talented, loving person who brought joy to so many. He believes that telling his story, with all its pain and complexity, is a way of giving Andy the dignity he deserves. The world may never know every detail, but it can know the love that defined their bond. And that love, Barry says, is something that death can never take away. He looks down, gathering his thoughts, and there is a sense that he is nearing the end of what he is ready to share. There are still so many feelings and memories swirling inside him, but speaking them out loud has already taken a toll. Yet there is also a quiet relief, as if telling Andy's story has lifted a small part of the burden he has carried for so long. In the stillness that follows, you can feel how deep lie this journey has affected him and how much more there is left to say. Barry's voice softens to almost a whisper as he reaches the end of his story, and in that fragile quiet, you can feel the depth of everything he has carried for so many years. He says that loving Andy was one of the greatest gifts of his life, and losing him was one of the deepest sorrows he will ever know. There are days when the pain feels as fresh as it did the moment he got that terrible phone call, and other days when it settles into a dull ache that never quite goes away. But no matter how it changes, it is always there, a reminder of a bond that was too strong to be broken by time or even by death. He talks about how, in his heart, Andy is still with him every time he steps on a stage, every time he sings a note that carries even a hint of the joy they once shared. Music became their language long before the world ever heard their voices, and that connection has never been lost. Barry believes that in some quiet, mysterious way, Andy can still hear him, still feel the love that flows through every melody. That belief is what allows him to keep going, even when the memories are painful. Barry also admits that there will always be questions he can never answer, moments he wishes he could relive, and words he wishes he had said differently. Those regrets are part of his grief, but they are also part of his love for Andy, proof of how much he mattered. He has learned that you don't move on from a loss like this. You simply learn how to live with it, carrying both the joy and the sorrow together. And in that balance, there is a kind of fragile peace. As he looks back on his life now, Barry says he feels grateful for every moment he was given with his little brother, even though those moments ended far too soon. Andy's laughter, his talent, his kindness, and even his struggles are all woven into the fabric of who Barry is today. There is not a single day that goes by when he does not think of him, not a single song that doesn't hold a piece of his memory. That enduring presence is both a comfort and a reminder of what was lost. In the end, Barry says that Andy's story is not just one of tragedy, but of love, connection, and the human need to be seen and understood. He hopes that by sharing his truth, he can help others see Andy not just as a fallen star, but as a young man who loved deeply and wanted to belong. And maybe, in that understanding, there is a small measure of healing, not just for him, but for everyone who has ever lost someone they loved too soon. The room falls silent as Barry finishes speaking, and in that silence there is a sense of something sacred, something that has been laid bare at last. His eyes drift once more to that old photograph, and for a moment it feels as though he is no longer alone. The love he shared with Andy still lingers, invisible but powerful, a quiet echo that will never fade, no matter how much time passes.